HorrorCultFilms Podcast. I'm David Smith, and today I'm pleased to share this interview with screenwriter Chris Watt to celebrate the release of his feature debut, Stalker. Stalker screened at Fright Fest this year and was easily among the highlights. No small achievement considering just how stacked that lineup was. It's a small, very contained horror about two people in a lift, a successful actor, and a guy who seems to be obsessed with her. I called Chris to discuss the writing process, developing his characters, and the joys of independent horror. Note that we don't go into spoiler territory, but it may be worth watching the film first to appreciate some of the challenges he had. Enjoy!
You're Rose Hepburn. I've seen you. I mean, I've followed you. Followed your career. Daniel Reed. Studio C. I shoot the B footage, behind the scenes, that sort of thing.
What is happening? Somebody please! Help us!
Hello, Chris. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Hello there. My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So, have you been a long-term horror fan?
I think I have, to be honest with you. Horror has always played a big part in my sort of cinema education. And it's interesting, I was born in 1980, so I'm part of the VHS generation, and we remember going into the video shop and those incredible lurid covers that you used to get for the horror section. They just don't do things like that anymore. That's why I love these prestige titles like Arrow that are kind of recreating that experience for a whole new generation of cinema goers and allowing them to experience these older sort of schlocky, nasty, gritty horror movies. But, growing up in my house, we had a lot of videotapes. And I do remember one of the very first videotapes we probably had, and this is not age appropriate in any way whatsoever, was we had An American Werewolf in London, which is probably the first horror movie I ever saw. Probably around the age of 5 or 6.
Ooh.
Not a good time to be seeing that movie. However, didn't do me any harm. So,
I mean, that transformation sequence must have looked amazing back then.
It's incredible. Weirdly enough, I mean, John Landis seemed to have shaped an awful lot of my childhood. He did a lot of the movies that I watched growing up. We had a lot of those on videotape. One of the other ones was Michael Jackson's Thriller that he did the music video for. And we had the videotape of that. And what I loved about that is that the videotape had an hour-long documentary after it, which was about the making of it. And you got to see how they did the makeup effects and the transformation. And they referenced it back to American Werewolf in London. And I remember that stuff being genuinely scary. It was weird that a film like the Michael Jackson music video was to be consumed by everybody, but it was absolutely terrifying as well. Certainly to my eyes. But then I was about 5 or 6 years old when that came out. So I probably shouldn't have been watching it, but, I am of the age that I remember seeing the videotape of The Exorcist before it was banned, because it was still
cool.
available.
With the spider walk sequence.
It was before that. This was just the original theatrical cut, but it was before it got banned on videotape, which I think was around 1988. So I remember seeing that. I must have been about 7 years old. That's insane to have seen that movie at that age. That's really stupid. And I don't endorse that with any parents, by the way. I'm a parent myself now, and I couldn't imagine letting my daughter see any of that stuff at that age. It's just crazy.
It was kind of the same. I was born in 1986. My older brother would be round about the same age as you, so he'd have these VHS copies of Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3, I remember being one of the entry ones. So if film's always been a big part of your life, how about filmmaking? What was your journey into screenwriting?
Well, I mean, I'd always enjoyed telling stories, and I'd always enjoyed writing just in general. I was a big reader as well as a kid. But my love of screenwriting really came probably around the age of 14 or 15. That's around the age that you start to kind of figure out and follow your passions, I suppose. And my passion had always been film. And so around that time, I started just looking into how films were actually constructed. And it all starts with the script. That's the very first stage. So I would start there and I would get as many sort of published scripts as I could get, and I would read them and just seeing the process of how you tell a story. And it's such a different discipline in terms of storytelling. Screenwriting is, there aren't any rules, but there are conventions. And of course, conventions are there to be broken, but the best screenplays sort of follow a very strict template and a strict pattern. And then, of course, you have the exceptions to that. You have your Charlie Kaufmans now who are breaking the mold apart and doing different and weird things within a screenwriting structure. But generally, I was looking at things like Raiders of the Lost Ark, or Star Wars, or the films that I grew up with. And I'm lucky to be part of that generation who remembers when summer blockbusters were actually written properly by proper writers who cared about story. I mean, you think about the first Superman movie, that was written by Mario Puzo, who wrote The Godfather, for goodness sake. I mean, that's a proper writer doing a comic book movie. And now we have this huge sort of like conglomerate sort of business of comic book movies that have taken over cinema, it seems, at this point. And I'm not here to badmouth comic book movies in any way, shape, or form. Some of them are great, but they are all the same template. They do the same thing over and over again. And I kind of longed for the period when summer blockbusters were written properly. And horror is a big part of that. Horror seems to be having a lovely sort of renaissance at the moment. And, the 90s wasn't, as far as I'm concerned, a great era for horror. It started around the mid-90s to look back on itself and become postmodern with things like Scream, and it sort of rebirthed the slasher movie, which is now morphed into its own thing. But in terms of horror, for me, I've always looked back to the 60s, 70s, and the 80s when they were really exploring nasty, horrible subject matter, and they did it properly. They always told a story. It wasn't just a set of kills or a series of set pieces.
And when it came to writing your first short film, which was made, I believe, is Manifest from 2015, but it sounds like there was a lot of scripts that were written and maybe chucked before Manifest. It seems like you were writing a lot in the background the entire time.
Absolutely. I mean, I went to film school in 1998, but from the age of 15 or 16, I was writing screenplays seriously. I mean, as serious as you can when you're 16 years old. Obviously, I look back at some of those scripts now, and they're terrible, but it's all learning. It's all school fees, those early scripts. And, there are little things within those earlier scripts that I have pulled and used in other things now, because, a good idea is a good idea, regardless of how badly it's been put together. But yeah, there have been a lot of screenplays. So I graduated from film school in 2001. And then there's about 20 years of screenplays right there. 4 or 5 feature scripts, a lot of short films, because short films were generally easier to get produced or to produce yourself. But you're right, the first short film that was kind of semi-professionally produced was Manifest, which was 2015. And then at that point, I sort of slipped into film journalism for a while. I'd written a book in 2012, a little fiction book, and that had been published, and that had done okay. But it was really after Manifest I started seriously looking at film journalism, and I worked as a critic for a few places, wrote for a few magazines, wrote for Total Film very briefly, and that's how I kind of built this little network specifically on Twitter of independent filmmakers and producers. And it was getting those connections that slowly started to bring me back into the screenwriting of it all. And it led to where I now am now.
When it comes to writing firstly, when you're making the transition from shorts to your first feature with Stalker, or your first feature that's now been professionally made, what's that like in terms of the mindset that you go into these things with? So I always kind of imagine the process for a short film is about identifying a particular scenario, a particular problem. But then when we're going to feature one, how does that change for you?
That's a good question. Yeah, I always find that short films, particularly short film writing, shorts are very, very good at sort of exploring a concept, not necessarily a full story, because there's just not enough time to really do a fleshed out, full-blooded story. It's mostly about a concept, or it'll take, as you say, it'll just take a scenario. You could just take 2 people tied together in a room with a bomb about to go off, spend 5 minutes with them trying to figure out how they're going to get out of it. That, to me, is how you could do a very simple short film. When it comes to a feature film, there are so many other considerations. You have to have a very rigid structure in place. You're looking at having a beginning, middle, and an end. Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. You're looking at having a specific plot point happen between Act 1 and Act 2, and a specific plot point between Act 2 and Act 3. Again, this is not this is not something that you have to go by, but generally, in order to tell a story competently, these are sort of structures that need to be in place. Then you have to look at your characters as well. And in a feature film, you have to develop the characters further than you would in a short film. You've only got a small space of time to tell us who this person is. In a film, you have to show us who a person is and then take them on a journey and give them an arc. And, otherwise there's no point in telling the story. You have to be seeing it through the eyes of somebody. And for me, the process has always been to start with an idea or a concept, as you would with a short film, but then sit down and say to myself, well, what kind of plot or what kind of scenario can I use this idea in? And on my desk, I have this big black notebook, which I call my book of plots, which is literally just filled with arbitrary plots that are not connected to a character or a story or an idea or anything. It's just plot structures. And I'll go through this notebook and I'll say, right, well, I've got the idea in my head. Let's see what plot would fit to this, or what plot would be interesting to use to explore this idea. Then once I find the plot I want to use, then I start thinking to myself, well, what characters would I want to see this through the eyes of? And it's very important. I think a lot of writers, and you see particularly in blockbuster films, the characters aren't very interesting. And that's because they're very sort of standard, atypical characters that they use within these sort of stories, because the special effects and the concept are what drives the movie. It's not particularly about the human characters at all most of the time.
Yeah, and I'm also thinking about how I suppose the demands of a blockbuster necessitate the characters are going to be relatively broad, because you've got to be likable to a large audience. Whereas I think when we're looking at small-scale independent horror films, they probably allow us to be a bit more experimental in terms of, well, how flawed can we make our protagonists here? What sort of vices can we give them? Because it doesn't always have to be a story of somebody like finding their inspiration or finding a source of strength they didn't know exists. In fact, quite a lot of horror films go quite the opposite direction, where we're watching someone getting gradually corrupted by something.
Yeah.
And where we're looking at Stalker, what was the original nugget for this idea?
Well, I mean, the original idea for me, I had an original treatment written for it back in 2016, but it didn't involve the setup as it is now. I think I'd seen Peeping Tom, which is that great Michael Powell film from the 60s. And that was about an obsessive, murderous cameraman. And I'd come up with an idea about a B-roll cameraman who's working on a studio. And it was set in Hollywood at this point. And he's working on a studio and he goes insane and he starts murdering people that are just one rung up on the ladder from him so that he can climb the ladder and become more ambitious. And that was the nugget of the idea. And then I sat and put that away in a drawer, but I never throw anything away. And then a couple of years after I'd written that, I found myself in a situation where I actually found myself trapped in an elevator in a shopping center with a couple of other people. Now, I was only 2 floors up, which is nowhere near as terrifying as possibly, being 18 feet off the ground isn't as scary as being 80 feet off the ground. So, it wasn't a traumatic experience, but it was an experience that stuck with me.
How long were you up there?
We were only up there for a couple of minutes. I'm sort of playing it up as if this was a terrible experience, and it was literally just a wee fault in the electrics, I think. But I'm not good in small spaces, so it was bad enough for me. And I'm also not good with other people, so that's just like a double whammy for me. So that idea always stuck with me. And again, it's a bit like going to my book of plots. All of a sudden, I took those 2 ideas and they kind of clicked together. And I thought, well, I always wanted to explore the idea of particularly women's role within the genre of the horror film and in the genre of the thriller. And I see it as a horror thriller. I don't see it as a straight up horror or Stalker. So when I had that in mind, I thought to myself, well, I'm still stuck on that idea of this cameraman, this obsessive cameraman. And then I just started playing the scenario in my head and thought to myself, what would it be like if you found yourself trapped in an elevator with your stalker? There's nowhere to go. What do you do? And what possible scenarios and outcomes can come from that? And that excited me, because I thought to myself, well, I'd seen a lot of films that supposedly are set one location. Like Devil's a good example of that. They sold that as Devil is a film in which the entire thing's set in an elevator, and it's not. About 50% of it is set in an elevator. Same with other one location movies. They tend to go somewhere else. And I wanted to see if I could write something that sustained the attention of the audience and was able to ratchet up suspense and tension and never leave that elevator, because there's nothing quite as claustrophobic and as uncomfortable as that situation, I don't think. And to then throw two characters into the mix in that way, you kind of write it like a stage play, I suppose. It is a character piece and it's a slow burn, but it allows you to then explore different themes through those characters.
Completely agree, because when I first saw the blurb, I thought, I got to see this movie because it's the ultimate no way out scenario. You know, like a lot of horror films will try and isolate characters who'll be stuck in a particular location, or for whatever reason they can't leave their house. Here you're like, all right, there's only two people and one of them's scared of the other.
Yeah.
And it's a fantastic setup. When it came to these characters, because obviously the characters are doing a lot of the heavy lifting here. We're not relying on big action set pieces. We're not relying on big special effects. So how did you develop these characters?
Well, that's a good question as well. And to be honest with you, the very first draft of the script I wrote quite quickly. I had just had my very first feature film screenplay optioned by a producer. And I thought, right, I'm going to take what little clout or exposure I've had from this, and I'm going to write something else really quickly. And we were in the first few months of the pandemic at that point. And I knew that the way films were going to be made, specifically independent films were going to be made, was going to have to shift and change because of this pandemic, which meant fewer sets, fewer characters, fewer of everything. And I thought, well, I can reduce it all down to this one location. That then gives you the challenge of making sure that the characters that you have are as good as they possibly can be. And, you know, I already had the cameraman character who became the character of Daniel Reed. I already had him, and I knew what I wanted to do with that character, and I knew who that character was. And I thought, well, now I have to find somebody to play off of that. And I wasn't interested in the typical female woman in peril situation. And I wanted to fight against that as much as I could. So I wanted to have her be as strong a character as possible, and to have her be clearly the more dominant character throughout the story. And when you have that, you know you've got a lot you can play with in that respect, because then it becomes almost like a chess game. You've got power struggles going on. And we were very careful, Steve Johnson, the director, and I, in the development of the screenplay, that we wanted to make sure that the characters were as fully fleshed as they could be before I even started to rewrite the script that I had. Because we went through a very long rewrite process on that. It was about 4 months of rewriting I did on that. Once Steve came on board, we got together. And I think it's important for screenwriters, particularly new to the business, to understand you have to facilitate the director's wishes as well, as much as you can, and find that bridge, that place where you can both be happy with how it's developing, because they're the ones whose name is going to be on the film. They're the ones that have to make it work from the page onto the screen. And in the case of something like Stalker, that's an incredible demand on the director. So you have to make sure that the characters are as good as possible, so that when the actors come onto that set, they know exactly what they're going to do, and they know exactly why they're going to do it. So we were very, very specific. I've got pages and pages of background history on each of those characters. I know where they were born. I knew when they came to university. I know what they studied. I know what they had for breakfast that morning. You know, yeah, and it got as intimate as that. So you have to kind of know your characters inside and out.
There's an excellent kind of game element to the film, you know, about how much is being revealed and when. I'm going to keep this as vague as possible and edit around any specifics that you give here, so as not to ruin the fun for anyone. But I'm wondering if there was a lot of substantial changes in when particular bits of information were revealed to the audience, and by extension, when they were revealed to Sophie's character.
Yes, there were. And a lot of that comes down to Steve, again, the director. He and I having discussions about what we wanted specifically to do. It's a film that I think for people, I'm gonna be as non-specific as I can be on this, because obviously, as you say, it'll ruin there are a few surprises in that movie. But it's a film that I think will stand repeated viewing, because the more you watch it, the more you'll see just how carefully we considered everything. When you watch it, you have to be considering the elevator. You have to be considering, is it going up or is it going down? Why is it doing certain things on particular lines? there are things to consider that are in there. There's the trolley, there's a security camera, there's there's a whole bunch of things, and every single thing, every element in that elevator we've used in a particular way. And if you have watched the film and then go back and watch it again, you'll see clues and little where we've planted seeds for certain things. So it's very carefully constructed. In a way that I suppose some people maybe won't be expecting from this sort of film, because we are working within a framework, within a budget, within a particular genre that you could cut corners quite easily and do something far easier, and not explore the themes that I think we have tried to explore in this movie as well. But you have to also be aware that you have to try and entertain the audience as well, and there are pleasures to be discovered on rewatching it as well.
Yeah, it was weird watching it with a large audience and hearing little bits of nervous laughter kind of coming out around the auditorium.
I was quite disappointed. There's one line, and I won't give it away, but it's a swear word, and I thought it would get a bigger laugh, and it got nothing. And yet, something that's not supposed to get a laugh gets one of the biggest laughs. You just never know what an audience is going to do.
How's it been actually going around? Because I saw it at Fright Fest. Has it been to other festivals as well, or is that was the world premiere, I believe, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. That was an incredible experience, and man, that's my first experience of a premiere of anything that I've been involved with anyway, outside of short films. So to have it in Leicester Square, have it premiere at Fright Fest, which is just the best audience in the world. I cannot say enough nice things about the people at Fright Fest. I did not meet one person that wasn't supportive and lovely and just full of enthusiasm. And you know what it is? And I've been to other film festivals. It's because it doesn't have prizes. So there's no mean-spiritedness amongst the filmmaking community. Everyone's there to show their movie and have a good time, and everybody had such a good time. The experience of the screening for me, I'd love to say that I was able to process it all, but it really felt like being in a goldfish bowl a little bit for me. I just, to this day, there are things that I don't even recall happening, because it was such a whirlwind. I didn't get to see any movies while I was there. I'm going to go back to Fright Fest next year just as a fan, just to sit and enjoy watching movies without the pressure of having a film to show. But we haven't shown at any other festivals, because after it world premiered, we already had a release date for a DVD and a digital release in place. So it was kind of just storming towards that. And I'm delighted to say that it was just this week we had the US distribution has just come through for it. It's been sold to the North American distributing rights. So it's going to release in America on a date release date. So it'll be in cinemas and DVD and digital in March next year, I believe.
So when it came to casting, did you have a hand in picking Stuart and Sophie?
Well, that's an interesting one, because the thing with Stuart is that Stuart was always on board to play Daniel, because he's the producer as well. So he'd optioned the script from me. And he'd optioned another script of mine earlier. And everything he options, I think he's always got an eye to a part he wants to play. And I mean, he's a writer and a director himself as well. So he's kind of like a jack of all. He likes to try everything. And so he was always meant to play Daniel. There was never any question that he was going to play Daniel. To be honest with you, we were asked to compile lists of people that we thought would be right for the character of Rose. And Sophie's name kept coming up. And I think that Sophie's name actually came up with Steve, the director's wife, actually suggested her, because she's a big Outlander fan. And I'd seen Outlander as well. And when I heard that name, I thought, I know that name. And then I went back and I looked at it. I was like, she looks just right. And at the point that she was doing Outlander, I mean, she still is doing Outlander, but the series that I was on at the time, she was involved in a very large storyline, which was to do with sexual abuse. And she was playing a character that was incredibly strong in the face of some really adverse threat. And I remember watching that and thinking, I think that she could be just the ticket for this. And, at that point, Stephen Stewart had been talking about her quite a lot, and her name just kept coming back to everyone. And so the script was sent out to her, and we were just very, very lucky that she had a space between the seasons of Outlander that she was shooting. She had a space to do this. And it wasn't to give her credit, she did not have very long to prepare for this. And I think that the performance she gives is of exceptional commitment for someone who had to come on board. I mean, the film was shot in like 2 weeks, stuck in this little box with a lot of dialogue, and she really, really gave it her all. I think they both did. I mean, in terms of performances, I think that film would not work if you don't have good performances. It just would completely and utterly fail. So the combination, I think, of them being able to elevate my words and Steve's incredible skill at managing to take something so small and make it cinematic was very important to the success of how that film turned out. And I cannot give the cast enough credit, to be honest with you. I really think they did an extraordinary job.
And I was just thinking, so I'm a researcher when I'm not doing this joyful podcast. And one of the groups I've been speaking to recently are former members of the incel community. And with his character, it strikes me with Stuart that like he's kind of going into the same kind of almost like entitled beta masculinity that we're seeing here. So as you said, that Sophie's playing a character who's more dominant than Stuart is, but at the same time, it's also something very specific about the kind of guy that he is here as well. You know, where we've got someone who's submissive, but they're also still a threat in other ways, or very emotionally manipulative.
Yeah. That's right. And I think that comes back to something we talked about earlier, is the idea that I know everything about the background of that character. I know the makeup that has gone into turning this man into the man that he is. Because, you know, as we all know, nobody's born evil, but we become these people over a series of time, and whatever we experience in our life and the things that his character has experienced have shaped him into the man that he is. And I think that's really interesting to see that you could make that kind of comparison, because there is a very specific sort of psychological manipulation going on. And I think that goes for both of the characters, to be honest with you. But with him, it is very specific. It's quite a demand for an actor. You have to ask him to play kind of meek and almost just a shadow of a figure, but there still has to be that threat to him. And I think the way he plays it, the places he decides to smile and the places he decides to sort of murmur his words and all that sort of stuff, that's what I talk about, the actors sort of elevating the material in a lot of ways, because it's a character that you have to feel sort of, it's a very divisive character, I think, in a lot of ways. And I'm trying to be careful with what I say, because obviously the third act takes us into an area that makes you have to question what you think about both characters and how you feel about both characters in terms of what their intentions are and what kind of people they are and what they're revealed to be. There's so much. It's a sort of thing where we could probably do a spoiler podcast where we could get a lot more into this, because there's a lot more you could probably say about it, but without spoiling it. It's that idea of, I suppose it's the idea of, and I'm not being specific to any character, it's the idea of allowing the audience to go away at the end of it and say, does the punishment fit the crime? Did any of these characters do anything specifically that would warrant what happens in that third act? It's an unusual juggling act you have to do, but it's also, that's the thing that I'm interested in, is to blur that line between what the moral questions are for both those characters. They've both got a very questionable morality, I'd say, in a lot of ways, and it all sort of comes flooding out. That was part of the beauty, I think, of having them trapped in this box, is that there is nowhere for this stuff to go but out. And when you're in a small box, what's going to happen when it all starts to spill out of you? Absolutely.
And the kind of power dynamic is quite unique one here, because you've got that she's been working on this movie set, and when you're looking at a blockbuster film like the one we assume that she's in here, we're talking about crews of hundreds of people where she reasonably would never have seen this guy, but he's got to be working to serve her, you know, to help her achieve her goal. And she's got no clue who any of these guys are. It's a very, very interesting setup.
Yeah, it's that voyeur thing, I think, and that's a classic trope of horror movies anyway. The voyeurism and the voyeur, you know, that goes back to Hitchcock. That's Psycho. That's that, and the idea of having him be a cameraman means that he's got an accessibility for his voyeurism. He's got a reason for it, and he can almost kid himself as well as anybody else that of course he was watching. That's what he does, and he can say he does it legitimately. So it's kind of creepy in that way.
Yeah, because it gives him a kind of an intimacy with her, but he's able to see her when her guard's down, when she's unaware that he's watching her, but he's able to videotape her while he's doing this, like between takes and stuff when the camera's rolling. Speaking of which, how the hell did you get Bret Hart in this? Because that was the other reason I watched this. I went, Bret Hart? Surely not. And then I went, oh, cool setup.
I will tell you this right now, David. I have, of all the questions that I get asked about Stalker, the question that comes up the most is that Bret the Hitman Hart? Yes, it is. Bret Hart is a good friend of Stuart, the producers. They've known each other for a few years. And Bret Hart, and I'm sure for any wrestling fans out there, they'll know themselves. He wanted to be an actor initially, and he's very, very serious about filmmaking and about film performance. And we were lucky enough that because Stuart has a relationship with him, I think they had been developing a project that they were going to do that never happened, but their relationship had stayed in place. And the idea of getting him for this particular part, and it's a small part, but it's an important part in terms of telling us something about who Sophie's character is and telling her about what kind of a world she's a part of, what she's up against in her job, which is very important. That speaks to the role of women in genre filmmaking in particular, where they are usually served up as pieces of meat, which thankfully seems to be changing now. There are a lot of interesting things. She's not just the final girl, but there are elements of that. But the Bret Hart of it all is that he was available, and he was, they shot his stuff in Canada. So his stuff was shot elsewhere, and then was through movie magic is able to be implemented into the final film. And I think it works because he is among his community, among his fans. He's a big name. He is a big name to get. And I know a lot of people have been quite pissed whenever they see that he's third billing or second billing in the film. And they're like, he's not in it for very long. I'm like, yeah, but it's an important part. And you need somebody who you immediately recognize in that way. And it's not that you're saying, oh, it's Bret the Hitman Hart. You're looking at him and saying, oh, this must be an important character. And he is an important character. And he has to make an impact. And so it was great to get him involved in that. And you know what? He does exactly what we needed him to do for the part. So it doesn't hurt as well in terms of publicity, because he comes with his own built-in audience, and they're going to go see it. Like I say, it's the question I get asked the most is about Bret the Hitman Hart. So
yeah, and also if Bret Hart was one of the biggest characters in the film, then I think potentially, and I say this with absolutely no negative judgment of Bret the Hitman Hart whatsoever, it then becomes the Bret Hart movie.
Yeah.
And I think in a way his presence would probably be distracting if he were taking up, like, say he was playing like a detective trying to get into the lift or something.
That's right.
Then that becomes the focal point. Whereas as a two-hander, it's pretty damn good the third character is Bret Hart. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I love it. I get a real kick out of it. But also, you're absolutely right. I mean, if Bret was essentially playing the Daniel part, the dynamic changes because he is physically so much more imposing than Sophie. The idea is to have Sophie and Stuart essentially as equals in that respect, because it makes the outcome a lot less clear. You don't know who's going to prove to be, because Sophie's character is more confident than Daniel, but we don't know what Daniel is capable of in the same way that we don't know what Sophie's character is capable of. So it would change the dynamic if you have someone who is clearly big. A good example of that is if you think about Psycho, you have the Anthony Perkins character. And then when they did the remake of Psycho, they cast Vince Vaughn. Very different dynamic, because Vince Vaughn's a big guy, whereas Anthony Perkins was this small kind of meek character. So the two different versions of Norman Bates completely switches the threat level or the dynamic in terms of those characters and the power struggle. So those things are important, I think.
Oh, absolutely. One of the examples people bring up is the second Freddy film, where because we see Freddy in the real world, and then you see him against these like jocks who are like a foot taller than him, and it just looks kind of stupid. Whereas when we're seeing Freddy with his own rules, he can suddenly become a giant, he can extend his arms, he becomes scarier.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm right in thinking some of the dialogue was improvised.
Oh, in Stalker?
Yes. Or changed through the rehearsal period.
Yes, through the rehearsal, some of it was changed. I don't know if any of it was improvised, but I know that, I mean, Sophie and Stuart would get up sometimes about 4 a.m., 2 hours or so before you would start shooting, to discuss characters. The discussion on these characters was very, very in-depth for both of them, which is what I find so impressive about someone like Sophie coming on board so sort of late in the day, to an extent. The amount of prep that she was willing to do, I think, was very impressive. And yet, it's something that I think, again, screenwriters need to be aware of, is that sometimes you will get on a set and a line or a setup just won't work. And it might work on the page. An actor just can't say the line, or an actor just can't behave that way, or the switch in tone doesn't work. And that's where a good director comes in and sort of gels it all together. And having actors that are of such quality, they know these characters inside and out. I have a very different relationship with the characters than they do, because, I can create them and I can have all the backstory I want. That's for me when I'm writing it. They're the ones that have to play it. They craft their own backstory and their own scenarios as to what has got their characters to this point. And so, I've never had an issue with actors changing lines, as long as it works. And of course, that's in conjunction with the director. The director knows himself if something's going to work or not. So, I mean, I'd say that you're looking about, and this is the same with any screenplay, it's usually about 80%, 85% your work, and then there's a 20% switch that belongs to the director, belongs to the actors, belongs to the editor, because the editor can be very, very important in how the story gets shaped. And he certainly was in this case. Stalker's got a very interesting third act, which wasn't constructed the way it is constructed now, and was far more straightforward in the script. And the way it was changed in the editing room, I think, just elevates it into something really strange and demented and interesting.
Speaking of which, we used the word elevated. So I got to ask, what do you think of the term elevated horror?
Elevated horror. Well, I mean, in terms of, I've certainly heard it a lot this year. A lot of reviews mention it. It's very clever, but
yes, an inbuilt pun for us. But
no, elevated horror for me, and I have an unusual relationship. A bit like my music tastes, my taste in film is just so vast and so wide. I don't have much time for terminology or what I consider kind of snobbishness. I find elevated horror is a kind of snobbish term. Horror is horror, and horror is also subjective. What one person finds terrifying, another person might find hilarious, and that's kind of the joy of any art form or any creative endeavor. Elevated horror seems to be the staple of people who want to sort of diss on things like A24 or horror films that are aspiring to do that thing that actually horror films have been doing for many, many years. It's just that the most popular horror films of the last 20 years have generally been kind of slashers and stalker movies and schlocky stuff that is, and torture porn as well, which is another term which, has its place, I suppose. But gore is always a big factor, I think, in a lot of what is considered popular horror. And elevated horror, for me, doesn't do anything different than, say, The Changeling did 40 years ago, or The Innocents did in the 60s, or The Shining did. The Shining would be considered elevated horror, I suppose, if it was made today, because it's approaching horror from a more, I don't want to say sophisticated, because even that sounds snobbish, but it's approaching it from a more, I suppose, a natural level, which for me is actually infinitely more terrifying, because there's nothing scarier than something that takes place in like natural light, with real people giving real reactions to something horrific, and usually something random. And you see it in the work of someone like Ari Aster, I think, is very important in that respect, because he lives in that area. He lives in the aftermath of violence. And that's the thing that I find incredibly uncomfortable to watch. And I love it because of that, because there's a sense of dread in his movies. And it's something that I'm really interested in trying to explore, that feeling of dread that something is coming and it's building up, and you don't know when it's going to happen. And I think he gets put into the elevated horror section quite a lot. But he's not doing anything that they weren't doing in the 70s.
Completely agree. I think a lot of the times the term gets used, particularly through newspapers, it tends to be because the person writing the article almost wants to excuse themselves for liking a horror film.
Yeah.
So it's, oh, well, this isn't mere horror, this is elevated horror.
Yeah.
And I kind of wonder about when you see labels like psychological thriller is another one that kind of gets tossed around when it's almost excusing the person likes a horror. Like Silence of the Lambs or Seven or something becomes, it's not a horror, it's a psychological thriller. Or the weirdest one is psychological thriller with supernatural undertones is another one that used to get tossed around.
Which ironically is what I'm working on right now. I understand completely on that. I mean, it's a bit like when people say, "Oh, this is my guilty pleasure." I don't have guilty pleasures. I just have pleasure. You know, I have no guilt about my pleasures whatsoever, particularly when it comes to films. I'll watch a Jean-Luc Godard movie and I will chase it up with a Wes Craven movie. I don't care. I love it all. So I don't get snobbish about that kind of thing.
Oh, absolutely the same. Like, I was recently watching the Shudder's list of 101 best horror moments. And whilst I'm not going to say what position these movies end up, it was interesting to see kind of something that's a bit schlocky, and then you'd have Hereditary immediately afterwards. And then it's okay, because we're going back to something like kind of silly again. You know, like horror's got so many different strategies, I guess, so many different frames that you can use.
And that's beautiful as well, though. And that comes back almost to me talking about the Fright Fest audience. They love it all. They'll watch it all. They love this stuff. And they'll watch any level of the genre. They don't care. They want to be entertained. Horror is as sort of legitimate a form of entertainment as a comedy, as a musical, as a character drama, as an action movie, as a comic book movie. It's just as legitimate. And it is interesting to me now that and it's going to happen at some point. Obviously, The Silence of the Lambs was essentially the first horror movie to win the Best Picture Oscar. We've never seen another horror film get to that level since. I was surprised to see something like Hereditary or Midsommar not get that kind of recognition because they're clearly as well made as these other films that are getting nominated. They're clearly as much care and attention and love has gone into them. And they're clearly just as good in terms of quality. It's just people don't like living in that uncomfortable place. They like something that's life affirming. And life isn't like that. Life isn't always life affirming. Sometimes life is goddamn horrific. And these are films and creative people that are reflecting that, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Terrifier 2 in the States has made an absolute ton, right? And it's been put forward as an Oscar contender. Now,
I saw that.
Probably not going to get anywhere, but I was thinking to myself, I'm like, okay, Terrifier 2, that really should at least be on VFX nominees list, right? Because you're looking at some absolutely outstanding kills for things like hair and makeup. So much has gone into making all of these perfect, or to use a pun, works of art, right? Yeah. But at the same time, I can't imagine it's going to get anywhere here.
No, that is interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think the closest you get is within the fantasy realm. When you got things like Lord of the Rings, I suppose, which, Peter Jackson lives in that area that is somewhere between the horror movie and the prestige movie. That's what I think is so wild about his work a lot of the times. And you see it in his Lord of the Rings in particular. Stuff with the orcs and all that sort of a lot of that's really horrific and really scary and nasty. And yet, these are films that get nominated for Best Picture at the Academy Awards. And yet, if you were to do a film that, had a rock solid screenplay, but was weighted in a genre of like a monster movie or something like that, all of a sudden it's not even something they consider. And I think you're right. You look at something like Terrifier 2, if they consider the budget for that film and what they're able to achieve on that budget in terms of makeup and effects, absolutely that should be in contention for awards. I mean, the fact that they're sawing a person's head in half shouldn't really matter. If you saw a person's head in half, that's incredible. They didn't actually saw a person's head in half. That's fake, but it looks real. Why is that not up for an award? But, you can't show a clip of that on primetime television, I suppose.
And when it came to watching the final version of Stalker, or in fact, if you were watching footage as it was being edited, how did it compare to the version of Stalker that existed in your head up until that point?
I was really surprised at how close it actually was. And I know that's something that doesn't happen very often. I know this is because this is probably my first experience of it, it's probably not going to happen again. Although I have had a similar experience on my next film, The Mire, which I just saw the final cut of as well. And it's, again, I'm having the same experience. I'm like, wow, this feels exactly like what was in my head. And I think that a lot of that is down to the fact that I worked with the director, Steve Johnson, on Stalker when we were developing the script. So we had the script really locked down in terms of what it was going to be, because it had to be. We only had a certain number of days to shoot it. You're in this tiny confined space. It really had to be what it was on the page, so that it was not going to be us wasting time on the set or them wasting time on the set. I was nowhere near the set because I don't think a writer has any need to be there. But that's just me. But no, when I finally saw a cut of it, I was very terrified and apprehensive, because I thought there's going to be just so much dialogue. I was reading back on my script going, God, it's all dialogue. Is this going to work? And thank God for good actors, because they managed to make the dialogue sing in a way that I wouldn't have imagined. And they make it more palatable, and they make it compelling with the way that they deliver a line, or where they pause, and their mannerisms and stuff like that. So I was really delighted when I finally actually saw it. I'd say it's 90% what was in my head at the time. And also the elevator that they designed was damn eerie in terms of what I had imagined. So
that was a fantastic set. Did you go and visit the elevator yourself at any point?
I didn't know. Steve was good enough to use his FaceTime on his mobile phone, and he took me around the set. You'd be really surprised. It'd be really fascinating for you to see if you can get hold of some behind the scenes of where that set was built, because it was shot on this place called Dunsky Estate, which is this beautiful sort of like castle resort hotel in Stranraer. And yet we were in this back kitchen area it was in this small area. They just built, the elevator is just 4 chunks of wood that they have dressed. And then the lighting, I mean, Simon Stollard was our DOP, and he and his crew, the lighting rigs he had where it makes it look like that elevator is moving, it just astonished me. When I saw it back and I look at it, if you don't know the process behind the making of it, that just looks like an elevator. It's extraordinary what they did. And I take my hat off to them. I think the crew was brilliant on this film. They did such good work in a small space of time, under COVID regulations as well. It was still in the end of the second pandemic at that point. So crazy.
Oh, wow. I suppose actually it's almost serendipitous, the idea of that entering the work with, all right, you've now got 2 people stuck indoors for the duration of this movie.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's interesting to me as well, as between Stalker and this other film of mine, The Mire, both of these films were developed, written, produced without me ever actually meeting any of the cast, crew, director, producer in person. It was all done like this. It was all done by Zoom calls. I've still not met the director of The Mire yet. I'm going to, hopefully at the premiere next year, we're going to actually meet up for the first time. And I only met Steve, who directed Stalker, face to face at Fright Fest. That was our first time meeting. So it was really strange to meet for the first time at the premiere of your own movie.
So, Martin, thinking with The Mire, you think you said earlier that it was written first, or it was successfully auctioned first, yeah? Or is that another one?
No, Stuart had optioned another of my screenplays called Follow Up, which nothing ever happened with, but it was optioned. Off the back of that, I wrote Stalker, which at that point was called Freight. Now, in between the writing of Freight, I had been speaking with Adam Nelson, who was a director that I wanted to work with, and he read an early draft of Freight, and he wanted to do it. He wanted to direct it. And he said, "Oh, would you be interested in me doing that?" I was like, "Sure." So he went away and started looking at ways you could do it, how you could build an elevator, where you could build an elevator, all this sort of stuff. And in the meantime of him doing that, Stuart came back to me and said, "Right, well, I know you've written another screenplay. I'd like to read that too." So I give him Freight, and he immediately wanted to option it. And I was like, right, well, now I'm stuck between a rock and a hard place. So I've got Adam who wants to do it, but it won't be for any money, or I've got money. And, and we all have to, I've got a daughter to feed. So I went with the option. But off the back of that, I said to Adam, I said, look, I feel like I owe you on this one. So give me a subject matter that you want to explore and you want to make a film about, and I'll write you a film. And he gave me this list of things that he wanted to make films about, and one of them was cults. And I sparked to that and I said, right, let me give you 5 scenarios for a story that we could do that could be contained, because we were still in COVID at this point. And he knew he had access to this huge church in Portsmouth where he lives that he wanted to film in. And he even gave me the specs, the layout of this church, so that I could write to the specs of this church. And I went away, gave him the scenario back, and he said, write me that. And that's how the mire happened. And so the mire happened in between Freight becoming Stalker. And then the mire happened. It is serendipitous. They both kind of happened back to back. The mire shot 2 weeks before Stalker started shooting. So when Mire finished shooting, Stalker started shooting. And now Stalker is coming out. The Mire is now finished editing, and it's going to come out. And it's really strange. Whoa. And that doesn't happen very often. And that's all down, I think, to COVID, because everything stopped. And all we could do was develop things. And all I could do was write. And all producers could do was read. So I kind of, COVID took an awful lot away from a lot of us, and it was terrible. What it gave me was time, because up until 3 years ago, I was a night manager in a hotel.
This is a hell of a change. Were you kind of writing while you're on the job at points?
Yeah, I was. Great thing about being a night manager is once your duties are over and everyone's asleep, you got about 6 hours of not much to do. So I was typing away. I'm sure my boss wouldn't mind me saying this now. I think the statute of limitations on me getting in trouble for that now wouldn't matter. I think I've earned it. Now that Stalker's on DVD on a shelf and he can see it, he knows it wasn't a waste of time. But yeah, I mean, and that's the thing. I spent the last 20 years working just normal jobs, but also, and it's a cliche, never giving up. I was always writing. I was always doing something involved in film. That's probably where the film journalism came in, because it was a lot easier to write film reviews and film journalism pieces while also working a full-time job. And then when COVID happened, everything shut down, including hotels. And because I had all that time, I just decided to have one last shot at it. Again, it sounds like a cliche. This was going to be my one last shot, and it worked. So I feel very, very lucky in that respect.
See that, listeners? Dreams can happen.
They can. I'm not saying it wasn't bloody hard work, but you have to persevere. It was really hilarious. I had I had a film student from my old university. I went to the University of Northumbria in Newcastle for film school. And I was contacted a couple of years ago by this film student who was doing the same course that I did. And she had heard that I had been in that course and was now working in the industry. And she wanted to do an interview with me. And she said, I want the interview to be about how you went from film school to a film career. And I was sort of like, I don't really have the heart to tell you that it was 20 years of being a waiter and working in bars. And it's only been the last 2 or 3 years it's really snowballed. But, the career is now snowballing, and I've got other things are now in development, and I've been commissioned to write other things. It does feel a bit like the dream's coming true. However, at the same time, you now have to treat it as a job, not just your dream. And it becomes a very different discipline, I think, in that way as well. So yeah, it's all really exciting, and films are coming out and films are getting made, and doors are now opening that weren't opened for me before. But having said that, I'm still trying to get an agent. Don't have an agent yet. Been trying this year, hasn't happened yet, but I'm doing okay without one just now. So we'll see what happens.
If any agents are listening to the Horror Cult Films podcast, get in touch.
If you're listening, you can find me at the Chris Watt on Twitter.
This movie, The Mire, what can you tell us about the scenario that you were pitching? Because I know it's about cults from the available footage, the available blurb, but at the same time, without saying too much, like what was the hook for this film? What was your way into this film?
My way into this film was the idea that I've always been interested in that one person who is always able to inspire people to do terrible things. It goes all the way, it goes back in history, years and years and years. It's always one person. You can go back to Hitler. One person, the loudest voice in the room, is able to inspire the most extraordinary things. And it's the same with these cult leaders. And I'm not a religious person. I don't aspire to it. I don't subscribe to any theory, this, that, whatever. And I don't belittle anyone of any faith, because whatever helps you and doesn't hurt anybody else, that's absolutely fine as I'm concerned. But I had this idea that I wanted to explore the idea of these snake oil salesmen, which is what they are. these cult leaders are essentially, they're like failed politicians. They're like political leaders who never gained office. And they're desperate for attention, that attention from people. And they also know how to exploit and manipulate. And the hook of the mire, essentially the idea behind the mire is that you have this character named Joseph Layton, who has spent 16 years creating a cult known as the Canon, which is his own fabricated religion. And he's mustered together this huge amount of followers. And it's based loosely on the Heaven's Gate cult. If you remember the Heaven's Gate guy, that was a very famous one. He had that weird video where he would recruit you and he had those kind of dead eyes, and they thought that a comet was coming that was going to take them away to another planet, and they ended up instigating a mass suicide. And essentially, this is about one of those leaders. And on the eve that they are about to ascend, as he calls it, which is essentially a mass suicide, he has no intention of going through with. He is absconding with the money he's accumulated from his followers over the 16 years he's been running this. And he's off. He's going to disappear. However, as he's leaving, he gets stopped by two of his most devout followers in his church who have come looking for him. And the whole film takes place over the course of this one night, and it's time running out towards the moment when they're going to have to instigate this suicide. And it's essentially the story of a man caught in his own web of lies, and these two people who believe every word he has told them and will not let him leave until they have realigned him, as they call it, back to the way of thinking, because they think that him leaving is a test of their faith and that they have to reconvert him, whereas he knows he's talking bullshit. It's bullshit, but he can't tell them that it's a lie because he doesn't know what they'll do to him if he does. So it's catch-22, and it's essentially a taut claustrophobic thriller about what happens over the course of that night.
That sounds like a really, really cool premise. And also similarly kind of small-scale character-driven stuff.
Yeah.
When do you reckon we're going to be able to see this one? Touch wood.
Well, touch wood. I mean, the film did just finish. We locked the final edit on it with all the music and the sound effects and special effects are all done. Speaking with Adam, it looks like we're looking at a festival run for the next few months, hopefully, depending on what festivals we can get into. And we're hopefully, I think, looking at a premiere either at one of these festivals or a premiere somewhere in the new year. So certainly into next year, there'll be this film, hopefully, touch wood, becoming available for people to see.
Excellent. And actually, one last thing I want to touch upon, a local issue. So we're both from same region of in Scotland. Recently, we lost our independent cinema, unfortunately, in the city. I guess what I'm wondering is, when we look to the streaming giants, something they can do is offer a platform for independent filmmakers. But at the same time, what do you reckon we're losing when it comes to local cinema chains? And do you think we're also losing something through streaming services, being what we rely on for distribution?
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting because I come from both sides of the argument. As a filmmaker, we have to we can't be blind to the fact that streaming services are a very valuable resource for independent filmmakers who just might not be able to get distribution any other way to get their film seen, to get some kind of revenue from that film as well. Having said that, streaming services seem very more orientated towards producing original content of their own now and working almost as a studio in and of itself. So the outlet for independent filmmakers is actually, it seems to be kind of narrowing. There's a lot of streaming services out there, and Amazon used to be very good at encouraging independent filmmakers to screen and distribute their films there. That seems to have shrunk down a lot now because there's so many other business interests involved in that. I think what we're losing when we lose an independent cinema chain like that is we're losing an accessibility and we're also losing an experience. I come from the generation when there wasn't a streaming service, when you either watched films on DVD or when they screened on television, or you went to the pictures to see them. When the Belmont Cinema started showing foreign language and art house films and films from all over the world, I could go and see a film from South Africa, I could see a film from Iceland in any given week. The fact that opened up my eyes at a time when I was starting to expand my horizons in terms of cinema and in terms of the art form that I love, they're incredibly important to our culture. And they're incredibly important, I think, to keep it region specific to Aberdeen, because we've got a very close-knit film community in Aberdeen. And we're not going to keep that if we don't continue and maintain through generations a film culture. And film culture just can't exist without being able to give the collective experience of seeing films other than big blockbusters and large Hollywood product within that cinema theater environment. Because you see it in America, you see when the Avengers all get together and have their big fight in the portal scene, and you see all that footage of crowds jumping up and screaming and whooping and hollering. That's a collective experience. You can have a very different but incredibly intimate collective experience with other people in these smaller independent chains, watching a film from France or watching a film from Kazakhstan or watching a film from any region of the world that's maybe been made for absolutely nothing. You know, a film like Bait, that film that came out a few years ago that was really raw, incredibly low budget, shot on, I think, cut ends of 16mm film. That film doesn't get screened in cinemas without the independent chains, without the foreign and art house cinema chains. And I think that it's a real shame to see that it has not become sort of feasible to keep and maintain that cinema. I hope and I'm optimistic that some people are going to come together and that this is going to be solved in some way. But, with streaming services really becoming more prevalent, and also the window between cinema release and streaming release is becoming so narrow now. Gone are the days when you had to wait 6 months between a cinema release and a VHS tape. So it's interesting. The industry has changed in a lot of ways, not all for the good. I'm very 50-50 on it, to be honest with you.
Yeah, so I remember seeing they called the Russo brothers. They were talking about this the other day, where they're talking about like their kids' generations, how they're going to be using the TV as their main screen. I like to think there'll always be a place for cinema, particularly in big cities. At the same time, for independent cinema, I guess if one's living outside, say, Edinburgh, Glasgow, London as the cultural hubs in the UK, I guess like in Aberdeen, for instance, where does a young person in Aberdeen get to go off and watch a film made from abroad a lot of the time,
Yeah, but, that's right.
Anyway, listen, well, hopefully they sort that out. Thank you so much for coming on. And
my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you very much. And everybody, Stalker is available now to purchase on DVD, and it's also available on streaming services as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
For news, reviews and reviews, check out HorrorCultFilms.co.uk. Music by White Bat Audio.